Hello, my name is Ashok Panikkar, and welcome to Metaculture Studio. Starting in 2008 and pretty much full time from 2013 to 2014, as the liberal world order started visibly deteriorating, I found myself trying to alert people to what I saw as the real and present dangers to our civilization. As you can see from the current state of India, the rise of authoritarian China, the economic and military weakening of the West, and the collapsing of social systems across the world, I may have been understating the urgency. Just for the record, without liberal democracies, ideas like peace, equality, and justice would be irrelevant. For that matter, without liberal democracy, you can give up on protesting the government's actions, reading your favorite author, or even talking candidly amongst friends. Those lovely folks in China, Saudi Arabia, UAE, and our own homegrown despots will tell us what we can do and how we can think. Since 2017, from my home office in Washington, D.C., I have been trying to educate people about our existential and civilizational crisis. You can find out more about our courses and activities from the link on the chat. The Metaculture Studio conversations are an attempt to go back to the basic foundation that underpins all social activities, and I would even say civilization itself, the warm and intelligent conversation. I don't know about you, but I'm tired of arguments, opinions, and angry people trying to beat up on each other. Here, we are not trying to persuade or even excite or even stimulate. Here, we are trying to model what gentle but meaningful conversations might look like. Each segment, I invite someone very special, not because he is a famous writer or she is a brilliant scientist. My guests are here because they are sincere thinkers and good conversationists whose company I enjoy. Welcome, Lauren. Hi, Lauren. So good to see you.
Thank you very much, Ashok. It's wonderful to be here. I'm excited to explore.
Excellent. So, I normally ask this question of all my guests. Who are you? I mean, obviously, I know something about you, but I'm sure our viewers and listeners would love to get a sense of who you are. So, tell us.
Thanks. I might start with that I am a glass half full kind of person. I tend to be more optimistic, pragmatic, but I would say there's a dreamer in me. You'll probably notice that in our conversation. So that's, I think, a good reflection. I, ever since I was in my early teens, I have always cared a lot about working in community and being in community. That's influenced a lot of my life, trying to learn how to show up with other people and also how to be creative in community. So that's taken on a lot of different expressions, but that's also part of who I am. I'm a very curious person, and I can see that I've been very curious about how change happens in particular. And that's one thing. I also love meditation, gardening, martial arts, and my Great Dane, my giant dog. So those are a few things. And I can also share a little bit about some of my journey
Please.
to this work, and particularly to thinking about democracy, since we'll be talking around that a bit today. Um, I think my work in reflection has always been an experimentation with participation and collaboration. I've been obsessed with new forms of participating in communities and in networks. Early on, I got a lot of my training and thinking around that with doing large community festivals. in my early 20s. That shaped a lot of my thinking around working with groups. And then I was able to work globally with a network focused on entrepreneurial communities. And this network was democratically governed. And
Mm,
that experience gave me a lot of things. It showed me how people from different cultures can come together to rethink their own governance, first of all, how they can collaborate across difference, and also learn how to create things together. And that was also the same time that I learned a lot about facilitation. And from there, I started doing a lot of my own facilitation work, especially around complex multi stakeholder collaboration. And then I realized I had a sort of specialty in working in conflicted situations.
mm.
Maybe it was my martial arts background. I felt good under fire, so I could deal with the heat. And I went deeper into conflict resolution and mediation at that point. And then after a while doing that work, there was still something missing. And what was missing for me is, okay, so I've done complex collaboration. Now I've gotten into mediation and conflict resolution. Where is the place where this meets the civic or civil world? I want to apply these things to our complex civic challenges. Like, where is the town hall that is melting down? And where can I be supportive? And slowly I started to find practitioners that were talking about reinventing democracy and looking at conflict. This is where I came across your work first, but also a number of practitioners around the world that are looking at what is the future of democracy. How do we reinvent our participation in society? And I found a home. I really felt like that was a culmination of so much of my journey, that so many of these practitioners are asking similar questions as I am, as what are the ways that we can make decisions together in such a complex world that also cares for many of the values you shared around equality, human rights, and it's not easy. So anyway, I have found my way to democracy and deliberative democracy work in that way. And it's a little too early to say, but I'm really excited to share that I am working on an initiative here in the US. I'll be happy to share more about that in the coming months with folks that follow along. But it is really looking at how can we apply the best of these citizen assemblies, which we can talk about more at some other point. But it's really looking at how can we apply some of that thinking long-term and regionally. A lot of these really cool democratic events that are happening around the world, they're events. And we see opportunity to actually practice some of this work on a longer-term regional level so that people can actually, have an opportunity to experience democracy in their day-to-day lives and not just every 4 years in voting. So that's a little bit about my journey. Thank you for asking me.
You know, what's really fascinating for me about your journey is that it seems really parallel to mine, even though we started in very different places. But regardless, we're both kind of really grappling with this question. Not just how can democracies be stronger, how can democratic processes be more robust, and how can people collaborate and make decisions? Not just the technical aspects, but what I particularly like about today's topic is, who is this democratic person? In other words, what is the democratic mind? Because for a long time, because I was associated with the, Harvard, MIT kind of approach towards uh, democratic thinking, towards conflict systems, towards multi-stakeholder work, I was under the impression, and I was actually advocating for robust processes and really strong facilitation that would allow democratic work to happen.
Mhm.
But the more I experienced things on the ground, the more I saw communities, organizations, and nation states, and the more I read history, I realized that the best processes in the world, the best systems can go nowhere unless the people who are working with them are infused with a kind of mindset. And that is what I call the democratic mind. And I'm really delighted to be exploring this with you, because both of us come from the technology of democracy, the technology of collaborative processes. And it sounds like we both have a fair amount of experience working with groups and in conflict areas. So here's my question. If I were to ask you, Lauren, what is the one democratic trait you have that makes you uniquely democratic in a way that is not common to everyone else? So, for instance, I mean, the reason why I put it this way, and the reason why I'm giving you this example, is so we can go a little deeper. So, some people would say, well, I'm a good listener. And for me, that's trite. It's totally trite, because for the past 30 to 40 years, it's become commonplace, particularly for therapists and mediators and facilitators and people who read self-help books, to talk about what great listeners they are. I'm trying to go into something a little deeper here, something beyond the obvious. I'm empathic. I'm a good listener. Can you identify something in you that genuinely contributes to your democratic mindset?
Hmm.
I'm putting you on the spot, aren't I?
Oh yeah, that's okay. I think um, there are two things that come up. I hope they don't fall in the trite category, but we'll see. We can spar
Let's.
about that. So I think one is perhaps looking at my adaptability. I see the ability to adapt and the willingness to adapt as a characteristic that's really helpful in being in a democratic mind. You know, I think we need to explore that a bit more, what we really mean by that. But I feel like adaptability is core, and knowing that working with change and adapting is part of what helps me feel open to change. And
Excellent.
so I want to say adaptability. And maybe one other thing that came to mind was something about connectivity, or how I see relationships between
Hmm.
things that are happening. I assume relationships between issues and people and events. And I am looking for, maybe the better word is patterns, but I care about those things. And those two things came to mind first. Let's start there.
Wonderful,
How
wonderful.
about you?
You know, other than all the trite ones, and just because it's trite, it doesn't mean it's not important.
Fair
It's
enough.
important. It's
But let's go
absolutely
deeper.
important. Yeah.
Yes.
But and I have to say, this took me a long time to develop. And while I have been tested, I'm quite certain that I will be tested even further, and I might not necessarily succeed all the time. But I am starting to recognize that the single most important democratic trait is courage.
Mm.
You see, the real reason why we capitulate, the real reason why we do not take the big risks that are involved in genuinely making space for someone else, genuinely compromising in order to collaborate. It's because we are terrified of upsetting our own allies,
Mhm.
upsetting the group, the tribe we come from, and pushing the group to do things that they really do not want to do. It's like everyone talks about speaking truth to power. And I find it laughable if you speak truth to Trump when he's the president. Because come on, you're living in the US. Trump can't do anything to you. You can march to Washington and, do all kinds of things. And, you know, yeah, so you feel you have shouted slogans, protested corruption, protested racism, sexism. Really, that doesn't take courage. It just requires time, energy, and a certain passion. It takes courage to do that in Hong Kong today.
Mm.
It takes courage to do that when your friends and your colleagues and your allies disagree with you. So for me, and it takes courage to do that when you are going to lose something tangible. So for me, apart from all the other, and I don't want to call them trite, I was just being facetious. Um, all those other values, I would throw into the mix a very healthy dose of courage.
And so when we're talking about, so why talk about the democratic mind? Why is that even something that we wanted to discuss today? Kind of, I think it'd be helpful to back up
Sure.
for folks and uh, talk about how we even arrived at this, and I think you got into that a little bit in your introduction. But, for me, what's interesting is when we're looking at the movement of democracy and how it's changing or how maybe it needs to change around the world, it begs the question, are there behaviors, thoughts, values, mindsets that are underneath helping democracy succeed or even behaving in a democratic way? And can we play with that and come to understand it better? And I think some of these characteristics you're talking about are a great example. And in contrast, I thought earlier, I think it was yesterday, I thought, what's a mindset that feels antithetical to the democratic mind?
Right.
Like, what would be something that's opposite of it? And I thought the consumer mind.
I love it. I love it. Tell me why the consumer mind is not democratic.
Yeah. So I think, first of all, I think it's about a complacency that things should be ready for you. It doesn't require much of your participation at all.
Right.
So that's different because democracy is implicitly participatory. That's its nature. It wants your voice. Um,
Can I ask you a question here?
oh yeah, keep
You
going.
see, Ralph Nader in the 60s and 70s really pushed for consumer activism, and he was trying to give voice to the consumer. And today, particularly, I see the consumers as having a voice. But is that what you mean by democratic mindset? The consumer voice saying United never lived up to its reputation for on-time, flights, and my burger is not as hot as it should be. How dare the government not give me enough coverage for healthcare? Is that a democratic mindset? This being able to articulate the needs that you have.
Uh, let's see. What do I think about that? I don't know that I think feedback is necessarily, I consider a lot of that feedback.
Right.
Um, And the difference between what I'm hearing you say and what I would think would be more democratic would be actual decision making power. So it's
Mm.
one thing to be able to say, I don't like my burger too hot. I want you to give me this. And having a lot of ability to voice feedback. But democracy opens up the opportunity for people to deliberate around their wants and their needs and then to try to make decisions about it. And the first stage of offering feedback is really the only the first stage. And so I don't really see that as very democratic behavior. I just feel like it's a cacophony of opinions.
So, in other words, it's complaining.
Yeah, that too.
Right. I love it.
Absolutely.
But thank you so much for bringing up this idea that the consumer mindset is different from the democratic mindset. If I could just take that a little further from my
Go on.
experience, you see, particularly in the last 40 to 50 years, whether it's the civil rights movement in many parts of the world, whether it's the increasing number of democracies, particularly after the collapse of the Berlin Wall, or social media, people seem to have a voice, but that voice is not necessarily something I would call democratic. It's as you say, it's a consumer voice because as a consumer, I sit here and I've elected you and I want you to deliver my services. If you don't deliver my services, I'm going to give you feedback, but I'm also going to make your life very difficult. And the way I respond to government delivery of services is pretty much the way I respond to a corporation or my neighborhood store or cafe. So for me, the democratic mind, as you said, has to participate. And I think that's really important in decision making. But what if the democratic person, the person we are talking about, does not have a role at the table to make decisions? Is your average person, who's holding a job, or a mother or a father, or is uh, living in the neighborhood and really has no influence with town hall, with city hall, with what's happening at the federal government. How would this person develop a democratic mindset without having any say in the decision making process? So that's something that I am really curious about. Any thoughts on that, Lauren?
Well, I actually think that that's one of the bigger dilemmas around the future of democracy in general is that your average person maybe experiences a jolt of democratic feeling once every so often when they vote. And then they go into the rest of their day to day lives. Uh, they go to a job that's still managed like a 16th century feudal system. And they don't experience that type of participation, choice, or democratic thinking in almost any other part of their day to day life. And I think that this is especially a challenge because our democracy isn't organized, or excuse me, our economy isn't organized democratically. So our entire work lives and the general economy, including consumer orientation and culture, yes, it interfaces with our democratic civil infrastructure, but those are two competing different systems on a regular basis. I think they give your average citizen an incredibly mixed message
Right.
on a regular basis. So I think that's a real dilemma, actually. And so when in the work that I'm doing, all we hope to do on a very simple level is give your everyday person more opportunities to practice and try being in some of these democratic environments, because we know actually that it, through research, people really love and can create excellent solutions out of it. And it's a great experience for them in many cases. But also, I think it's the only way that we're going to be able to see if democracy has a future is if actually more people have an opportunity to try it out.
Listening to you, Lauren, I am struck by attention. It's almost like a chicken and egg situation. Um, so here's on one hand, we have institutions that are not as healthy, democratically speaking, that are not as participatory, that don't have the kind of systems and processes and access that allows the people who are influenced by the or affected by the system to participate in it. So, as citizens, how much of a role do we have in the government or in our governing systems other than voting once in 5 years? So
Mhm.
that's one. But the other, and the same thing is true in the work environment, for instance. Okay,
Very.
but that here the emphasis is on institutions becoming democratic and then training us to be equally engaged in those democratic systems. So here's the tension for me. I'm wondering if the institutions are the cart before the horse. And I'm wondering, particularly when I see the collapse of democracies around the world. India is a case in point. I think America is in deep trouble. I think France is in deep trouble. I think tomorrow, if Germany runs up against trade sanctions from China or from the US because of geopolitical issues, we will find German democracy to be very weak.
Mm.
One of the things that really bothers me is we are counting on the institutions to be almost perfect democratic systems and our leaders to manifest democratic wisdom. Now, when I look at, because of the work I've done in India and in the US for many years, when I look at democratic systems, I find that the ones that have survived, even at a micro level, are the ones where the people in the system, not the leaders per se, but the people in the system are able to model a democratic mindset. And so this, and it's I'm not suggesting it's one or the other. I'm just saying that there is this tension when we normally critique democracies, we critique the leaders, we critique the systems, the institutions, and that's true. It's important. So let me say what I think this the grassroots mindset ought to be.
Okay.
And for me, there's one word that I find useful here.
Okay.
It's a word which is, again, on the edge of right because everyone uses it. It's a liberal mindset
Okay.
that you cannot be a Democrat in any meaningful sense unless you have a liberal disposition. In other words, for me, a liberal disposition is not about anti racism, anti sexism, or gay marriage. It is open mindedness. And the difference between someone living in Saudi Arabia, someone living in China, and someone living in a Western country, or even when I was growing up in India, amongst at least the educated, what I people call the Nehruvian Democrats of the first 2 to 3 decades of Indian independence, was that this is something they have in common. The openness is in terms of one being open to the idea that your worldview and your value system is not the only legitimate one. The second is that your group is not the only vital group that we need to be catering to.
Hmm.
And the third is being open to experimentation, which includes negotiation, compromise, and even failure. I so again, let me just I'll just contrast this with what is not. if you're living in China and you have no access at all to decision making, you don't even have freedom of speech. And the same
Yeah.
is true in the UAE or Iran or Saudi Arabia. You are a subject. You are really not a citizen because you're subject to the decisions that are made on your behalf. And when things don't go right, you have a right to not articulate it, but to believe that, you know what, the system stinks because it's not giving me what I should have. Because I'm a victim. I'm poor old me. And I am not being taken care of by the system. It's a paternalistic system.
Hmm.
Whereas an open minded mindset would require from us, the citizens, the energy and the hard work that needs to be put into understanding how things work, understanding the complexity around the system, that there are other people and other needs that may conflict with me, and that I
Yes.
can't always get what I want. And so for me, the one word I keep coming back to is the word liberal. And again, not liberal as opposed to conservative, because you can have classic conservatism in a democratic system which values the good things from the past.
I want to go deeper into that actually.
Please.
I think that that is a really unfortunate uh, language issue that we're in, especially at least in the context of the United States. I'd like you to deepen on that point. It felt kind of tangential, but we got there. And I wrote it on my notes. I thought, how can we work with this language that we have around democracy right now as being seen only as progressive
Mm.
and alienating other more conservative groups when I actually think there's something more fundamental. I think you've started to spell out some of these more fundamental qualities. You kind of gave them the banner around liberalism, but nonetheless, there's some of these fundamental qualities and ways of working and thinking that can also be held by more conservative folks. And it's not just a progressive way of thinking. So, can you navigate a little bit more
Sure.
through that?
Um, I mean, it's funny. Even in my courses now, at one point, it all comes down to language, but not the kind of language which is about toxicity. It's not the language which names and shames. You can't use the N word or the F word or whatever. It's really about trying to understand what these words really mean, and taking ownership and bringing the meaning back into the words. So, for instance, of course, one can talk about different kinds of democracies. There are illiberal democracies, there are just representative democracies, and all that kind of stuff. But that's technical. What you and I are trying to grapple with here is really interesting. So, the first thing that I would do is remove the word progressive from the democratic equation. Because progressivism is a very clear ideology. And there are many assumptions that progressivism makes coming out of its ideological baggage. And progressivism, at its very basic, means that if that everything can be better, that everything should be better. And it's our responsibility to keep pushing until things become as close to perfect as possible. I find that extraordinarily arrogant. Extraordinarily arrogant. Liberal doesn't mean that everything can be better, but it does mean that you come into every situation with the open mindedness that includes skepticism.
Mm.
So, the main difference between the liberal and the orthodox, I'm not talking of the conservative, I'm talking of somebody to the right of conservative. The orthodoxy or the orthodox are incapable of skepticism towards their rituals, their traditions, their scriptures. It doesn't matter if you are an orthodox Islamist or Christian or Marxist. You are wedded to your sacred book, your principles, and you will hold on to them. You're not skeptical about it at all. Whereas a liberal comes into even liberalism with skepticism. A liberal does not consider any liberal value an absolute. It's kind of like science for me. Science is for me liberalism. The science that says that we can probably never understand the universe in its entirety. But at every point, we can work very hard to understand how reality works. Reality in terms of the natural world, reality in terms of our bodies, reality in terms of the way our systems work, that we bring a certain inquiring mindset. For me, that is liberalism. And science is also very clear. There are no complete truths. Every time a scientist comes up with something, he puts it across as a hypothesis. And science works only if it's falsifiable. And whatever I settle on today, based on my empirical evidence, my testing, my reasoning, tomorrow you might be able to completely falsify and come up with a better theory. And that's the beauty of science. So for me, science is not a
Hmm.
dry, drab thing that is like a religion. It's anything but that. Conservative for me, as opposed to orthodox, is different from liberalism, or the conservatism is different from liberalism in the context of a modern democracy, in that they have a little more faith in what has come before us.
Mhm. Mhm. That's
They say, you know what? We've survived for 5 generations. We must have been doing something right.
uh-huh. Yeah,
You
that it's
know,
not all doesn't all need to change all the time. Yeah.
no. And it doesn't mean that a classic conservative is a skeptic too, but not maybe to the, is a little more reverential
Uh-huh.
than the liberal. The liberal can say, you know, to hell with it. Let's question everything. A progressive says, let's change everything.
Mhm.
This is the fundamental difference. This is why I see progressivism as a regressive movement. It's almost akin to fundamentalism. I have the answers. I have figured it out. Racism is the biggest threat on the planet. Let's completely change all systems to eliminate racism. Or economic inequality is the biggest problem. Let's redistribute everything right now. That's fundamentalism. I've worked with fundamentalist Hindus and Muslims and
Mm.
evangelists. Let me tell you, the language they use is no different from the language of progressives.
Yeah, I think that these extremes in either way can be an expression of concrete thinking. And it's important to navigate when we are in that concrete thinking mode uh, in either spectrum. And I'm curious, if we can ground the conversation further now in some of our own lived
I
experiences
love it.
where we have either experienced or not behaving or trying to work in a democratic way. And one of the stories I wanted to tell, and then I would just love to open it up for you to share an example of when you were democratic or not. Um, but before I get into some of my specifically democratic experiences, something that I was thinking about while we were talking and also yesterday before this conversation, I had a really specific educational experience in my early 20s that changed my mind and my thinking forever. I lived next to a woman who was a cognitive scientist. Her speciality was around creativity and also Alzheimer's. And so she was very curious about different mind states and has published a lot about this. And I knew that she taught classes when she was a professor at university around systems thinking. And in my early 20s, I was very interested in the topic. And I asked her if she would give me a independent study.
Wow.
And she obliged. And I, I came to her with my list of books I thought I should read. And I'll never forget this. She sat me down and she said, "That's fine. You can read any of the books that you would like, but I am going to propose a different way that we work together." She had a lot of training around somatic psychology and different ways that the mind actually learns and develops. And she said, "This is actually a way of thinking. You can read about this, but this is actually a different way of thinking." And one of the activities, for example, that she did with me is she would have me think of a topic. And she said, "Now imagine that that topic is a tree, and I want you to bounce from branch to branch and think about all of the other things that are related to this topic.
I love it.
And just keep bouncing. Now go to the next branch. Now what's another branch? What's another relationship? Why is that happening? Who is that related to?" Go on and on until I developed every idea into a tree, essentially, of related thinking. This was one of many activities this woman did with me to help me understand the interrelated, systemic nature of our world. Rather than reading a book about it, she actually helped me be a systems thinker. And when that gives me actually a lot of compassion for what we're talking about, which is that it took somebody coaching me through and modeling a different way of thinking for me to think differently. And so for us to say that democracy is on the horizon and we should all be excited about getting there, when in our day-to-day lives, we get very few opportunities to try it out, I have a lot of compassion for why maybe it's not going so well. Even if it's a possibility, which I believe it can be, and I've had some great experiences, that one educational experience showed me how important it is actually to embody change, and that it takes that kind of modeling. And so if we want more democracy, we're going to have to experience it more. And so I'd love to know, when was a time, maybe two questions. When was a time that you feel like you were experiencing kind of a peak democratic moment in an organization or a project? And when was a time when you were the least democratic, perhaps, like you said, the most despotic, and went against some of these values you're talking about? And what was happening for you in those two moments?
It's so much easier to answer the second because I have so many examples, experiences of becoming despotic myself. And yeah, seriously. And let me also qualify this by saying, for the past 30 years, 32 years, I have consciously tried to be, in the best sense, democratic. And particularly in the first 10, 15 years, I kept failing miserably. And I didn't understand why I was failing. And now I keep trying, but I make a distinction between when I need to be democratic and when I don't need to be democratic. See, it's kind of like you can't be, so let's just say you play football. You can't be a footballer all the time. When you come on the pitch, on the ground, you play football. When you go to the cafe, for heaven's sake, don't throw that ball around. You know, so for me, I have realized that to be democratic, while you must have a democratic mindset, there are situations where everything, your skills, your experience, your knowledge, and your mindset come together to allow for a democratic process to take place. And then there are other situations where you continue to have the democratic mindset, but you say, you know what, I'm sorry, I need to get this done. I need to be directive here. I need to give you instructions because you don't have the same experience that I have. And I'm reminded of one of my best professors. His name is Trilokesh Mukherjee, and he used to teach in England, but he used to come for a semester at a time to India, to my design school. And We were all in a design school or an art school very democratic. So we would question professors, and in the 70s we would smoke in the classroom, and the professor would hand out cigarettes. It was a free for all, okay? And we would question everything the professors would say. I'm talking India in the 70s. This was an island of the most experimental, most liberal American educational system at the National Institute of Design where I studied.
Okay.
And this guy came from the UK, and he was stunned to find us questioning him far more than the English students would. And at one point, he literally told us, "Now, slow down. I know you guys are all brilliant. You're all 19 and 20, and you have answers to every problem on the planet. When I give you an exercise, I'm giving it to you so that you can learn something new. I have been doing this for 20 years. So, in these 20 years, I've figured out what the most effective way of going about this is. If you can show me a better way, I will let you do it. But if you cannot prove to me that your way is better, I need you to be quiet and do it my way." That was a democratic decision, because democracy is not free for all. Democracy is knowing when and who should be making a decision, or who should even be contributing at a particular
It's
point in
deliberate.
time. So just to give you an example of my, not just an example of why I fail so often, particularly in my 30s and 40s. I wanted to be democratic. I genuinely wanted to collaborate. I wanted to be innovative. I wanted to question everything. But what I didn't realize is, underpinning all of this was the fact that I was self centered. Everything came from the perspective of, but I'm Ashok. This is who I am. And this is what I want. This is what I want others to think of me. And this is my self image. So every issue, every task was kind of coated with an Ashokness. And then I wanted to collaborate. And with that, I wanted to be democratic. There was too much of Ashok in it.
Mm.
It took me a couple of decades to realize I was self sabotaging my democratic processes by putting too much of my self in it. This is something I'm constantly working on. And I would say, when I succeed in removing the self, I am able to enable much more collaborative processes and much more. Yeah, it's just beautiful.
I think
Don't
that
get me
that's
wrong.
probably part of the democratic mindset. I think that
Exactly.
that's a deeper, um, whether people want to call it self-centeredness, or some people might refer to it as their ego. There is something to that, right? Where you are not the uh, overly prioritizing yourself, and you're able to balance your needs with the needs of others, and that is not a common trait. I mean, I think that that is something we have to. One thing I really appreciate, just to reflect, is the humility of this conversation, in that, we're saying, oh, the democratic mind, wouldn't that be great? And then we're just actually showing how darn difficult it is
It does.
to even power share, put ourselves at, deprioritize ourselves enough to allow other people space. And that's also going on in the background in
Absolutely.
these experiences. So I think, I studied a lot about my entry point into democracy. Actually, was during my education, when I was studying organizational development. And I became obsessed with organizations that were experimenting with democracy. And now there's wonderful networks like World Blue, which are, hundreds of organizations that have some type of democratic governance. Anyhow, I then years later had an opportunity to work. And in that global network, we used a democratic governance method called holacracy. And it's a really cool process. And what was most fascinating for me is when we couldn't do it. It was very well thought out.
Of
The
course.
logic about how we would organize, how we would make decisions together, how we would hold these governance meetings. And even then, people still made unilateral decisions. The cult of personality, so people being more popular or more sparkly, more interesting, more forceful, still took precedence sometimes. Like, okay, we're just doing this because I'm the boss. And I'm like, wait,
Right.
but we decided that we all had authority. How are you the boss now? So that would come in. That was fascinating when that would still crop up. And the deep participation that it required could be exhausting.
Right.
And that was, it was something I have had very little opportunity to talk about. I was really proud of us for trying. I was really proud of us for trying to manage in this new way. And I think it was great in many aspects in terms of dignity, creativity, but it showed some dark spots around people's level of responsibility, their ability to sort of self-authorize and have leadership. That was hard too. People really just wanted to be told what to do. It didn't work so well. That was something that didn't function either, is our tell me what to do mode.
Right.
Didn't work.
No.
And that was a big cultural thing because it was an international group and some people felt more comfortable with tell me what to do than others. And so that was also an interesting dynamic. So that was a very powerful lived experiment for me of watching these different dynamics that we've been kind of talking about over the course of the call.
Right. I want to come back to this tension between brilliant processes and our less than brilliant capacity to manifest them. I want to go back to the whole question of self-centeredness.
Okay.
Now, in critical thinking, we talk about two traits that are very, very destructive. And for me, critical thinking is the epitome of the liberal mindset. Okay. It's because apart from everything else, that's one of the things that I have a master's in critical and creative thinking. So it's something that I have been working on for about 32 years. And the two traits are one, egocentricity, that I look at everything from my lived experience. That my experience is the pole, is the North Star around which everything else revolves. It's normal, it's natural, and it makes it very difficult for me to really see complexity. The second is sociocentricity, that my tribe, my group, makes it very difficult for me to bust out of its own boundaries, its own biases and prejudices in order to see complexity. For me, it all boils down to this. The only reason I need an open mind, I need a liberal mind, is in order to understand reality. And reality is bloody complex. My mind, my tribe, my family, my ideology only allows me to see a slice of reality. So this is another reason why I am so against identity politics. One of my biggest grouses with the Democratic Party in the US, activists, social justice activists, and progressives, is that the moment I take on one of my identities, at any given point in time, it could be my race, my gender, my sexuality, it doesn't matter what it is. I am I am putting on blinders. And when I put on my blinders and I engage with you, and you have a different set of blinders, it pretty much makes it a given that we will not be able to collaborate. And I don't get me wrong, I understand why identity politics started, why it was important. I know that. I know the history. I can also understand why sometimes it is tactically important. But here we are talking about the democratic mindset, and that is not a democratic mindset. It may be at best a non democratic, illiberal, but tactically useful stance to take in order to advance a certain cause a few steps. But
Mm-hmm.
the moment you get stuck in it, you destroy the democracy around you. So far we've been talking about a individual mindset, but there is also a collective democratic mindset, and that collective democratic mindset is very tenuous. Because
Very.
if I lose my anger, if I lose my temper, I can destroy it in a matter of seconds. It's so vulnerable. Everybody is on eggshells, trying very hard to not be egocentric, not be sociocentric, and somehow find a way to listen and understand and collaborate. And if one person says no, this is my lived experience, and if it doesn't work this way, you are all oppressing me. There goes the democratic, collective democratic mindset. We are all then taking care of that particular person. Anyway, so I just needed to throw that into the
I
mix.
appreciate that. Thanks. I'm just sitting with that because I guess it is an when I talked about that teacher that really helped change my thinking. I also attribute a lot of your work. I think you do a lot of helping us think about our thinking.
Right.
And this other teacher, she really pointed out what it meant to be in these sort of concrete mental spaces, right? Meaning they're and I think you are giving examples of that, whether it's around identity, that it is useful to a point, but if the ultimate object is for us to figure out how to coexist and to work together, those different identities or even deeply held opinions, they only suffice for so long, in which we're going to have to learn how to grapple with one another. And we'll either do it through conflict, sometimes brutal, or we'll actually have an opportunity to co-create something together. One or the other will happen. And I think that the democratic mind is an effort to recognize where there's a ton that's informing us, our history, our ancestors, our biology, our families, but that we have an opportunity to consciously work with other people to make something that is of greater benefit. Because all sorts of other random things could happen. We could fall into violence and conflict and some random moments of beauty. But I also think it's a conscious effort
Absolutely.
in understanding the limits of some of our identities, the limits of our beliefs,
Right.
and where we have to extend beyond that. And I think that that kind of flexibility you've been naming is part of this mindset that allows for that. And I'll come back to what I shared initially, is that to me, that is part of getting behind adaptability.
Right.
That flexibility and
Of
adaptability
course.
feels core to this way of thinking and working, but it's not easy. And we've already pointed out all the ways that are, that we're terrible about doing it. We've had more practice being in authoritarian spaces and working in hierarchies, in deep hierarchies, than we ever have working in democratic ways. And just by virtue of ratio of how much time people have to practice this, it doesn't surprise me also where we're at. Most people still have deep-seated the sort of authoritarian desires to have the strong person lead and just tell me what to do. Again, back to my experience with the working in a democratically run company, people sometimes just threw their hands up. And that was antithetical to what we had agreed on. And I think it's at the crux of being able to cultivate this mindset at all is like, what is the motivator? Why would your average person even care about this and want to develop these things in themselves?
Very interesting. And I'm tempted to respond to many of the things you have put out there.
I think we have some questions now.
Yes. And so I think Pilar has asked the first question, which is basically, so how do you define the democratic mindset? So um, Lauren, just take a quick crack at it, and I'll build on that. So, what do you mean by the democratic mind, and is it a kind of a culture? Do you want to take a quick 1 minute crack at it?
Yeah, I think it's a type of mindset we're talking about that then creates a type of culture. That might be the first thing I might say. What I've heard from our conversation is that the mindset is focused on openness, less egocentricity, that it is focused on and open to critical thinking about our ideas and our beliefs and willingness to grapple with that with other people. It has a sense of responsibility to self and others, which isn't always required in other mindsets. Those are a few things that I would say are inside the democratic mind. Over to you.
Wonderful. That's a great way to start, and you've done justice to a bulk of it. And I'll just add a couple more.
Please.
The first I would add is abject humility, not just ordinary humility. The recognition that if I want to coexist with anybody else, with even a modicum of equality or egalitarianism, with if I want to take others into consideration and get them to co-create with me, the group, the organization, the country, or the relationship, I have to recognize that I will not get everything I want. That it is all that I want is not useful to me. So I'll give you an example from my personal life. Now, I'm married now. I've been with Stacy for 5 years. It's great. I was in long-term relationships in the past, and they all broke down at some point or the other, even after a couple of years, because what I wanted in many ways was non-negotiable. Then I was single for a long stretch of time. And guess what? Suddenly everything was my way. The kitchen sink could remain the way it was for 2 days if I wanted to. I could order the kind of furniture. I could decorate the place exactly according to my design sensibilities. I could do everything my way. And I was utterly miserable. Why? Because it's in that relationship, it's in having the relationship and in coexisting in a relationship that I could be all of who I am. In other words, for me to be all of who I am, I had to give up a lot of things that I wanted. So, this idea of really acute sense of one's own insignificance vis-a-vis the universe is very empowering, because the moment I let go of my ego, wow, I suddenly can give, I can listen, I can share, I can even get things I didn't know I needed. So for me, humility, and for me, I come back to the liberal mindset. the democratic mindset is a liberal one because when we say open mindedness, it's really powerful. It's not being open to black people or gays or that's all just small stuff. It's specifics, it's ideological, it can be dogma. Real open mindedness is in opening oneself outside of one's dogmas, outside of one's needs and beliefs itself, which is so un American because America is a country based on the privileging of the I, the me, the mine. And so this is one of the tragedies of democracy today. The most democratically vibrant society, the US, destroyed itself by becoming way too individualistic.
Mm-hmm.
And so this the democratic mindset for Pilar as a question. It's a combination of different traits, but it all starts with openness and with wanting to coexist in an egalitarian way. It doesn't mean perfectly. It doesn't mean perfectly democratic. It means sometimes you're not democratic, and that's okay, provided you do it in a deliberate, conscious, mindful way.
I also
So
want to bring up the courage point that you made earlier. That it
absolutely.
is that ability to self-authorize and to lead and to take action on something is a characteristic that some people feel more comfortable with and some people got more practice with, you know? And so I think that courage piece is not to be understated as well. Let's see what other questions we got going on here.
So here's one from Raju. Consumerism is more complaining and giving feedback, except there is a conscious consumerism that is making more impact. Would you agree or disagree? Lauren, you want to take a crack at that?
Oh, sure. I mean, I think that yes, I would agree. There are
Of
consumers,
course.
there are individual people around the world that are using their feedback or they are mobilizing to change markets and to change products.
Right.
And I think that that's powerful. I think it shows people who have agency, who are willing to work together to act. I think that that is getting in a bit more of the democratic spirit, you could say, is that they are realizing that they have agency to make change. And
Absolutely.
I think even more of that would be helpful in especially in practicing more democracy within the economy. So
Right.
more, please. Yes.
Yes, I agree with you, and I just want to say, but that doesn't mean that the consumer mindset is the same as the democratic mindset. These are completely different because the role of the consumer is to sit back and take delivery of services and products. The role of the Democrat is to engage with the system and co-create it. I can be a consumer of uh, an ice cream, Ben and Jerry's, but I'm not sitting and helping Ben and Jerry's create my favorite flavor. I
Or
have very
decide where to
little.
steer the company. Yeah,
Right,
sure.
right. So I don't want to confuse. You
Agreed.
can be a more democratically oriented consumer, but a consumer mindset has nothing to do with the democratic mindset. I just want to be very clear about that. Quanta says one needs to understand the word progress. Progress towards what? Advancing. One can also progress in the wrong direction. I totally agree with you, Quanta. And all I'm saying is that the idea of progress itself is limiting. But I agree with you. What is called progress can go any which way. Nirmala asks, what is one small step for India that would benefit the majority of people? That's a that's a trillion rupee question, Nirmala, because we are in a place where no small steps can work at this point in time.
Mm.
We have passed the tipping point. If you had asked me this 10 years ago, even 10, 20 years ago, I would have given you many small steps. The one small step I can think of, and I'm trying to explore this with some groups that I'm working with in India, is this: the health system has collapsed. India is moving towards, if it's not already an authoritarian state, We are losing most of our democratic institutions and values. We are not democratic as a people or as a government. And we are at the edge of a humanitarian catastrophe. The one small thing that may help is that we reach out to the government, reach out to the right wing nationalist forces, and offer to collaborate at this late stage and say, we are not trying to destroy you, we are not trying to defeat you. We want to work with you to prevent genocide in India.
Mhm.
For the moment, we don't even want to dethrone you from government because you have 3 more years as elected representatives. You have 3 more years. Can we help you prevent this tragedy? I tried reaching out to a group of people, and the first reports are they don't even want to talk.
Mm.
Everybody is so polarized. They don't even want to. They want to get rid of the right wing government in by any means possible. I understand that sentiment, but it's heartbreaking to see that the democratic mindset doesn't even exist in a country like India. The protest mindset does exist. The activist mindset exists, not the democratic mindset.
And isn't it fascinating that, I mean, I can't comment on India, so I will leave that to you. Thank you for sharing. And one reflection is that um, it's really important for us to not get ahead of ourselves. We need to be better at actually assessing reality more clearly. We can't be forcing our notion of a democratic system down the throats of any group or country, because I think what we're exploring here is the notion that this is more of a capacity,
Right.
and that it's through the capacity of people to behave or work in this way that then institutions and systems are created. If we sort of shove systems and institutions down people's throats and expect them to respond when this doesn't make sense for them to work in this way, it's the wrong order. And the painful part is assessing that a system might be really far away from having these capacities.
Absolutely.
And these types of suggestions require a lot of humility to say, we're far away from that. But the closest thing would be for us to be able to come together. Like, even just that is a gesture towards what we've been talking about. It's the most simplistic form of it, but it's really where we're at. And I
Right.
think that we get overzealous about what we believe in terms of democracy and our notions of progress and where we hope for the world to be without actually looking at where people are at.
Right.
And that's a painful gap that I think we need to mind.
And this is the problem with perfectionism,
Hmm.
and I mean, that's good for 8-year-olds and it's good for acid tripping hippies, but it's not good if you are responsible for the fate of human beings. So there are a couple of questions more.
Right.
I have one. Champakas is very, very up your street. So if you can, in a minute or two, address this one. Do flat organizations sometimes create competition among members? What does that mean to social responsibility between members? What does it mean for social loyalties? If That's three questions, but particularly the first one, I think, is something that you would have some ideas on.
I I think that we have natural urges to compete with one another. And a flat organization, in my experience, actually gives us an avenue to talk more about what we need. I don't know that it makes, I've actually seen the opposite, where in a more adversarial, hierarchical, or competitive environment where people are trying to move up a position or things like that, that it actually creates a more of a competitive and adversarial environment. Whereas what I've noticed in more flat organizations, people are become more comfortable saying what they need, where they want to grow, and see it less about other people and more about their own development, about where they're going, versus in other systems where people see other people in the way of them to get where they need, or they see a reason to take advantage of someone else to get what they want. I feel like in a flat organization, there's more of a sense about coexistence. And so I would say no.
Can I disagree with you, Lauren?
Okay.
So, particularly over the last 30 years, it's become a buzzword, flat organizations,
Okay.
non-hierarchical systems. I've consulted with many of them, and I have found there's no such thing as a flat organization. It's something to put up on your website and something to get bragging points on, because any organization worth its name that has a mission and is out to create a product or sell a service or meet a need has tremendous accountability. In other words, if as an organization you're supposed to do, say, provide water to the neighborhood or the community, there's enormous responsibility that comes from having to supply water. And a flat organization very often diffuses responsibility and diffuses accountability and ends up, as Champaka said, with enormous competition, which needn't have existed. So when I look at that, I see this trend, which is particularly in the 90s and early 2000s, for everyone trying to go flat. I see that as this fervor of idealism and a reaction against traditional hierarchical systems without people having thought that through. Now, I totally agree with you. A very rigid hierarchical system is totally competitive and it can be brutal. And the film that comes to my mind is Glengarry Glen Ross, which is David Mamet's brutal film about real estate. And it's just, but the point is, we all have examples of how numbing and cruel and barbaric a hierarchical system can be. But remember what you and I were talking about. Human beings are inherently hierarchical. We are inherently egocentric.
Yeah, I guess for me, I guess because the question was about competition, I think what you're pointing out for me speaks to where this sort of notion of distributed and flat can be dysfunctional. And I don't necessarily know that dysfunctionality for me always translates into competition, but I do agree with you that it can completely diminish the ability to focus, to be responsible, to pull in a strong direction, and to actually get things done. And so that is sort of the dark side, I think, of the flat organization. Although, and I do agree actually that people still have competitive drivers, even when they are working democratically or in a flat way.
Can I just say, I have experienced in flat organizations extraordinary competition. The difference is the way it's articulated. It's passive aggressive. See, and this is what in say General Motors or in a government, very flat. People are very vocal about their competition.
That's actually true. And it reminds me of that amazing essay called "The Tyranny of Structurelessness," where the author talks about in activist groups, the soft power, abuse of soft power, essentially. And that just because we think we're being progressive, flat, anything like that, it actually doesn't mean that we are caring for some of these more destructive, competitive, egotistical ways of working where we're taking power over other people. And so, yeah, I guess maybe I'm changing my tune. I don't know This was a good one. Thanks for this
Right.
great question. I think this is helpful for me to flesh out more. I might change my answer, but I have permission to do that.
You do. And I just want to talk about an experience I had with with the Occupy movement.
Oh, great. This is
Uh,
a very good example of this type of
yeah,
dysfunction.
yeah.
Yes.
And I was visiting from India, and I was here to give some talks, and I was in New York for a few weeks at the height of the Occupy movement in Wall Street. And I was invited to talk with some of the leadership groups, the leadership group and a couple of others. And I have to say, nothing has depressed me as much as the irrationality, the dysfunction, the backbiting, the inability to collaborate as the meetings that I was privy to at the Occupy movement. And it was shattering for me because I was sitting in India when I heard about this taking off. I was so inspired, and I thought, wow, my trip is going to coincide with this. I can go and learn from these people how they're doing it. It was just a totally uninspired squabbling session where, or a couple of squabbling sessions where people with the best intentions, by ideologically giving up structure, ideologically giving up hierarchy, ideologically determined to be totally equal, destroyed everything around them. There is a need for structure, there is a need for order, there is a need for accountability. So, my problem with all these buzzwords is that these are trendy kind of fashions, political fashions, ideological fashions,
Mm.
spiritual fashions that we take on because, hey, we're tired of what isn't working and we want quick change. We're not willing to do the hard work, to do the homework, to understand it well enough and prototype it and try it and fail and admit our failures and finally come up with a better system. We just want to get rid of the old system and replace it with another.
Yeah, we don't have an integrative perspective.
No,
Yeah, no, not
no,
at
no,
all.
no, no.
Let's
Well,
see.
so just so you know, Lauren, we have about 8 minutes more. I am going to give you the pick of any of the question. Is there one that you particularly want to do? And then I would like to also wrap up.
Great. I want to first thank Chanka again for that question. That was a good learning loop for me. Thank you for that. That's why I like this conversation a lot. So let's see here. Let's look at these last two here. I'm really, I think I'm going to go, I think let's go for Suzanne's question here. They're both very good, but this one is a fun one. It's provocative, which I would definitely expect from Suzanne. So thank you for that. Does creating a democratic institution necessarily depend on everyone within having a democratic mindset? Or is this just applicable to those who are leading?
Go for it.
Yeah. I would say that it requires a degree of everyone having that mindset, but that having that infused in the leadership is essential. This is also, I think, in respect of natural hierarchies, actually.
Right.
I think that the situations I've seen working really well, that were more democratic and organized, the leadership was very much embodying this, very clear, very strong on it. And that allowed the rest of the group to have different degrees. Nobody completely antithetical to it, but different levels of experience, practice, buy-in, etc. If the group was more democratic, but the leadership was not, implosion every time. I think that this shows that we're still learning about what our relationship to leadership is, how that changes for us over time. This plays a big role in that. So the first scenario is what I've seen working well. So I would say that that's my lived experience about that. I don't think it's one or the other, but the leadership is essential. and maybe we'll evolve, one day to be a species that doesn't require that type of signaling or type of leadership. But we are human, and right now, I think that leadership plays a really large role in it. So that's my take. What about you, Ashok?
I think I would agree with you that without visionary liberal leadership, you have no democratic system. In fact, I would go to the extent of saying that I have rarely seen any democratic system being implemented from the bottom up, particularly in terms of organizations and particularly in terms of nation states. It's usually visionary leaders who say, we don't want to be kings. We don't want to be dictators. We want a democratic state where everybody is empowered. So it starts at the top, but you cannot sustain it long unless the people at the bottom also acquire it. India is a case study. In 1947, the leadership in India was extraordinary. I mean, they were visionary, extremely democratic leaders. And I just want to finish with this anecdote. Nehru, who was uh, the architect of modern India, once wrote an article anonymously when he was re-elected as Congress president. He wrote an article anonymously saying, "Who is this fellow Nehru? He could become a dictator if you give him too much power. He is vainglorious, he's egotistical, and we need to be very careful of giving him too much power." I mean, can you imagine the wisdom and the vision, the democratic mindset of Jawaharlal Nehru? That he warned his people about his own ego. Unfortunately, we, the people of India, and that includes most people I love and I care about, we are feudalistic. We are not democratic. We are not open minded. We are not liberal. And this includes because I work closely with NGOs and activists. They are not. There are a handful of us, not us, sorry, there are a handful of real Democrats in India. And that's why we are in this situation now. Lauren, thank you so much.
This was
It was, wasn't it?
Thank you.
And I want to say, anytime you want to come back to pick up on any of these, I'm happy to have a sequel.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I love the exploration. Thanks everyone for your questions. I learned a lot today. And I think we did justice to exploring why we even wanted to talk about the notion of democratic mind. And I look forward to picking up some of these other threads next time. Thank you, Ashok.
Wonderful. And so, what I'd like to ask all of you who are still with us is please put down your thoughts about the session and any other questions that you might have, but your thoughts, your comments, we really appreciate it. And now I have to end by giving a plug because we desperately need people to join our courses. Lauren was in our first or second course, and I'm looking forward to her coming back for some of our new courses. Now, we are going to have a slide very soon talking about the two courses that we are offering. The first one is next week on May 14th. We are offering the critical thinking course. It's the first time that we will be offering a 12-week course in critical thinking. And I can assure you that it will change the way you think about thinking. Our flagship course, the Culture, Conflict, and Democracy course, is now going to be offered even in the evenings. So, starting on June 7th, we are going to have on Monday evenings, 6 to 7:30 p.m. EST. This is more convenient, I realize, for North America, South America, than for Asia, even though I know that in Singapore, it'll be 6 in the morning. It's not a bad time to get started with this course. Thank you very much. And for any of you listening, if you're interested in having a conversation with me on an issue that you are passionate about, please feel free to write to me. Shri We'll be putting up our email IDs and the links to our website and everything else. Please keep in touch. So, thank you again, everyone. Thank you for joining us. And again, Lauren, it's such a pleasure to talk with you.